Hi everyone, it's Mark from Samaritan's Well. I'm here again with Carolyn Dunegan.
Hello.
She's our LCDC counselor, that's licensed chemical dependency counselor, but she's also a pastoral counselor and an ordained minister. So welcome, Carolyn.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Will.
So glad you're here again. And today we're going to talk about boundaries. We could call it constructive or destructive boundaries. We could call it healthy versus unhealthy boundaries, but there's really some things to learn about this. Could you just kind of jump us into that topic, Carolyn?
I think this is so good to unpack this because boundaries has become a buzzword. And so what happens is people will say, well, I need to set boundaries, but they don't quite know what that is. Or someone will think they've set a boundary when they're really just being a little controlling.
Yes.
Or they won't understand why they don't set boundaries. Even outsiders will say, well, why didn't you say something about that? Why didn't you put a stop to that? So we have to talk about what are boundaries and why don't we set them when we should, and what does it look like when you set a boundary that's fair.
It's good.
Or, you know, even if a boundary doesn't go over well, if you set limits with someone and they're angry, have you misstepped?
Right.
So there's some good things to talk about.
Tell us about what a healthy boundary is to start with, and maybe if we know what the real bill looks like, we could understand the counterfeit better.
Yeah. So I think first is for people to have a sense of self on board.
Okay.
A personal sense of right and wrong, a personal sense of who you are. I can do this, I can't do that. This works for me, this does not work for me. And if you don't know who you are, and you don't know how you feel, you can't set boundaries. If someone's a little numb or a little detached, or they're passive, or they're really afraid of conflict, they're so swayed by emotion that moment to moment what's right and wrong for them will change according to who they're with.
Oh, yeah.
So a boundary can just be an expression of, here are my rights and wrongs, here's my value system, and here is what I can and can't do. So if that changes according to who's mad at you or who likes you or who you're in front of, then you don't really have boundaries.
You don't really have boundaries.
You don't really have boundaries, right?
Yeah. So when you think about categories, we'll come back to healthy boundaries and examples. But when you think about categories of like unhealthy boundaries, what's a first one that you might mention and tell us a little bit about?
An unhealthy boundary, the prime example here is silence.
Okay.
I'm just not going to talk about that. I'm not going to fight with this person. Now, the difference between silence and boundaries is if you have something you're not going to talk about anymore, or you think something is not right for you to talk about, or you think something has turned into an argument, you have to talk about that. Yes. You have to say, hey, this is a conversation I don't think I want to have anymore, or this feels like an argument, or you know what, I don't want to talk about this. It's starting to feel a little bit like gossip. So when you tell someone you're not going to talk about something anymore, then it's more of an adult exchange.
Got it.
But to simply disappear on someone or to change the subject when they bring something up, that's just confusing.
Yeah. Silence leads to confusion, right?
Silence leads to confusion. Another good example of a not great boundary is control.
Okay.
So someone will say, well, I'm just setting a boundary. No one in this house is ever doing this again.
Right.
Or you're never using my car again. Don't ever ask me for another, Right. So when you unilaterally tell someone what they can or can't do, you can't call it a boundary. It's just a control.
Yeah.
And you can't unilaterally set boundaries unless it's about your money, your car, your life. And so when you're telling someone else what they can or can't do, they need to be 3.
Yeah.
So for you to set those, you will not. You are. But also, I think another example of control is when you will, in an accidental way, most people don't do this on purpose, they will do something that's actually a punishment or a gotcha.
Okay.
and say, well, I'm setting my boundaries.
Oh, yeah.
And so they may be right about what they're doing or not doing, but the spirit of it isn't clean. It's a gotcha. It's hateful. And when you do something in the wrong spirit, it's even with a right outcome, it's damaging. And so punishment, control, it is really in a subtle way. Those are kind of like bully tactics.
I was thinking about like 3 examples in the area of, is this control or not? So I'll throw this out. One, you have a smoker friend and you say, oh, we're riding in my car today. I don't want you to smoke in my car because I'm really trying to keep it clean. 2, you're riding in their car and you say, I don't want you to smoke in your car. And what was my third scenario? I was thinking about a third scenario too. But how would that fit? Just as a simple example of what's a healthy boundary.
That's really good. Well, 25 years ago, I was the smoking friend.
Right.
But I quit smoking 25 years ago. So I can speak to this one.
Good for you.
Okay, the first one, it's your car.
Yep.
And again, done in the right spirit.
Yeah.
Hey, if you don't mind, I don't mean to make you uncomfortable, but I don't have smoking in my car.
Yeah.
It's a new car.
Yeah.
So it's not a question. This is how it is in my car.
Yes.
But again, speak with love.
Right.
The second one, it's the other person's car. That's where you can't say you're not smoking.
You're not going to smoke.
Even nicely, that's where you have to ask.
Yeah.
So respect.
Yes.
And I tell, like I coach a lot of women, and I'll say, don't tell your husband. Ask him.
There you go.
Can you? Would you?
Yes.
How would you feel about? Because that's a show of respect.
Yes.
So this other person's car, hey, I know this is high maintenance, but would you mind would you not smoke while I'm in the car?
Yeah.
And you have to let that person say no.
They get to decide.
They get to decide.
And you might have to take an Uber, or you might have to take your car.
And you need to be nice about it.
Yeah.
Because in the world of respect, that is their car.
Yeah.
You know?
I like that. And I will just tell you from a husband's perspective, it is so wonderful when my wife asks something instead of telling me.
You need to.
Although once in a while, it's like, hey, it's her car. And we say, no, don't do that in my car.
Right.
Okay, it's your car. You get to tell me.
Right. I challenge people, and I'm not picking on women. I see a lot of women.
Right.
But I'll challenge them to get the word you out of their vocabulary.
Yeah.
How can you talk about that without saying you? Like, ugh. So
it's tricky. And so one of the things you'd talked to me about before the podcast is we'd talked about boundaryless, like no boundaries, and we talked about fractured boundaries. Could you talk about those two for a moment and tell us a little about that?
Well, so think about someone who grew up in a home with a parent that raged. And they learned systematically over time. You don't have to tell children, don't say what you think, don't say how you feel. They just
pick it up.
They just pick it up, and they internally, intuitively stop saying anything that would draw wrath to them. And they also have a second construct in that environment. I'm not important, only this person's important.
Oh, yeah.
So they have a construct that there's one important person.
The angry person is important.
And the angry person is the important person. So that person will leave home with all those thoughts. And they won't set boundaries because, one, they have the construct, you're important, not me. They have the second thought, well, if I say something that makes someone unhappy, something terrible will happen. It'll all blow up. So they naturally default to not saying what they think, not making requests, not saying how they feel, because that training, that early training to just squash what they really need to say.
And they're trained really in not loving themselves, right?
That's good.
They weren't loved. And we understand from Ephesians chapter 5 that the definition of love is to nourish and cherish. And so I think a big part of boundaries is I'm not just trying to nourish and cherish you, but I'm trying to do that for me too, right? And so that person without a voice they just don't have that construct, like you said, of nourishing and cherishing themselves. It's all about that other person that could get angry with me and pleasing them and being that people pleaser, or that we call it the peacekeeper, right?
The non-person.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, when you have a really angry adult in a house, you usually have someone that's enabling it.
Yes, you do.
know, or saying, well, mom's tired, or mom's doing her best,
Yep.
or, well, your mom loves you.
Yeah.
So when children try and talk about what's happening to them and you shut it down, or, there's Christian confusion. So a man blows up or verbally abuses someone in the house, and a woman will come and say, well, we have to respect dad.
We have to honor
We
dad.
have to honor dad.
Yeah.
You have to forgive your dad. Which is true, but the place before that is talk about what happened. Maybe dad repents.
Yes.
Or mom calls it out and says he shouldn't have done that.
That's wrong.
Then, hey, you know what? Let's forgive. Let's honor. So, again, that training to not have boundaries, to not say what you think, and even the confusion of, well, this is a way for me to show love, is to not ever say what I think.
And really, that confrontation that you talked about, that's really a part of boundaries, isn't it? Because you're calling it what it is. Wait, this is causing pain. Something has to change.
Right. So the person that has fractured boundaries,
Okay.
so that was the boundarylessness. And also, if someone doesn't ever have boundaries, you frequently will say, where do you want to eat? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Where do you want to go? I don't know.
Yeah.
Or they have to hear everyone else order at a table to know what they're going to eat. That person has so little identity.
I will tell you, I counseled a lady back in the 90s. She was in her 20s. Had come from one of the most traumatic backgrounds that I'd ever seen. And I remember just 2 or 3 sessions in, something dawned on me. I wanted to ask her a few questions. I'm like, what's your favorite food? I don't know. What's your favorite color? Oh, I don't know. What's your favorite place to go, like on vacation, if you could go? I don't know. She had all these I don't knows because she had grown up like a chameleon. As a matter of fact, the only even close to having a decisiveness answer was, I said, what's your favorite thing to drink? And she said, well, I used to say Coca-Cola, but then I realized one day it makes me sick to my stomach every time I drink it. So she had to grow up as this chameleon because it wasn't safe for her to have an identity.
Yeah.
So she had to relearn not just her identity or her value, but what does it look like to have a yes and no? Because the Bible says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. And it dawned on me a few years ago, that's a gift from God, to have a yes and a no. And every person gets it.
Yeah, if you don't have the early experience of personhood,
Yes.
you don't know what you think.
Yeah.
You don't know how you feel. And you can't set boundaries if you don't know how you feel.
Yeah.
And a clue for someone that doesn't have a lot of personhood or identity on board is they'll have something bad happen, and 3 days later they're driving along and they go, hey, wait a minute.
Right. The injustice is 72 hours removed,
It
right?
has to go through the filter of not feeling, not knowing. And this
Yes.
is the person that their friends will say, didn't that make you mad?
Yeah.
How come you didn't say
3
anything?
days later it did. Okay,
Yeah.
back to fractured boundaries. Tell us more about fractured boundaries versus no boundaries.
So, no boundaries. You don't know how you feel most of the time. You are confused about right and wrong. And based on how the other person feels, you may or may not react. Okay, fractured boundaries. Typically, there are 1 or 2 people in your life you don't set boundaries with, but you do with others. So an example would be someone that's this amazing executive. They're just a rock star, running this big company, making all this great money, and they go home and they turn into this little unassertive, like, oh, I don't know. Well, I don't want to make her mad, or I don't want to make him mad. So someone that's extremely functional out in society, but no function at home, passive, or they have a secret life. They drink heavily, no one knows.
Right.
They're using drugs, no one knows. And so fractured boundaries are when it's almost like two people. A subtle form is when you can set boundaries everywhere except your 7-year-old mom.
Oh, there you go.
Which is most people who don't set good boundaries with their parents do set good boundaries with their kids or their spouse or their friends.
Right.
So fractured boundaries come from having someone in your life that the condition of the closeness is by you not setting boundaries. So like a mother or a dad that will pull their love and approval away.
Okay.
I'm going to come in and out of your life. I'm going to withdraw my presence if you hurt my feelings or you don't agree to have Thanksgiving at your sister's. Or if you tell dad, hey, you're scaring the grandkids, he's not going to talk to you for 2 days.
They'll punish you.
Yes. Right. So fractured boundaries, it's probably one or two specific people where you don't function like a grown-up.
And so we would probably say, is that person with the fractured boundaries, they haven't overcome that fear of facing that punishment and facing the wrath, right? Because you're going to have to face it to ever break through it.
Right, because at the base of punishment, typically, someone has used their presence and withdrawing their presence. I'm going to give you my presence, I'm going to withdraw my presence. And so it's subtle, but it's abandonment. And if you dig down, if I tell dad not to yell in front of the kids, well, he might not come. Well, he might not talk. Well, he might be mad. Right. Or he might not come back over. Or he might not. Well, then what would happen? So really, someone usually that's controlled by abandonment has been manipulated with the use of abandonment.
Yes.
Silence is abandonment.
Yes.
Not speaking, pouting, withholding love, withholding touch, withholding conversation.
Guilt trips,
withholding sex. These are all forms of abandonment.
Sure.
Someone that systematically puts other members of a family first if those family members stroke them or make them feel good about themselves. You can see it inside of a company. You know, where there's favorites. It's certainly in a family. But what I say is if you believe someone will leave you if you set boundaries with them, you're usually right.
Yeah, that's true.
And get it over with.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times they will circle back months or years later and they'll come back in a configuration of two grown-ups.
Yes.
Instead of me in charge of you, it's us side by side.
Yes.
But if you believe someone would leave you, if you were truthful with them, you're usually right.
Yep.
But we just don't know what that'll look like. Is it temporarily or forever?
No, because it could just be, right? I mean, let's be honest. Some manipulation is just a bluff. It's like, oh, Grandpa says he'll never come back if we...
don't let him smoke in the car.
If we don't let him smoke in the car or the house or something, right? We don't let him drink and drive with the grandkids, But we finally have the courage to confront it. And then you're right. A lot of times it turns out like, oh, wait, my grandkids are important or my children are important. Hopefully the children are important. Adult children are important too. But I like the way that you put that because those are all forms mostly of manipulation, although some of the threats can be intimidating too. So, we always talk about manipulation or intimidation, but they're both forms of control, right? So really, a lot of what you're talking about with the fractured boundaries is a person that's never overcome agreeing with that spirit of control.
Right.
And if you can come out of agreement, you can start to get those fractured boundaries healed. It just takes courage, right? It takes a lot of courage to do that.
I remember something you used to say, like the enemy loves to say, this is a big deal.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
And so that person, the specter of I'm not going to like you.
Right.
It still works even in our 50s and 60s. I'm not going to like you. I'm not going to come over.
I'm going to punish you.
I'm going to think you're a bad person. I'm going to tell someone else what you did.
Oh, yes.
So the enemy comes and goes, this is real. This is big.
Yes.
And you almost have to say, you know what? The highest, expression, I think, of recovery around these kinds of issues is to say, you know what? If you don't like me, I'm not going to die.
That's
will
powerful.
be okay. If you leave
That's
me,
powerful.
I will go to work
Yep.
and I'll run my errands and I'll worship and I'll go to the store. That you have to understand the thought of someone leaving you is usually worse than what it is.
Yes.
And often if someone is abusive, because even if it's a subtle threat, that's emotional abuse.
It is emotional abuse.
Yeah.
And really, when it comes down to it, and I know these are stark words, but that person has been bullying you. And if you keep giving lunch money to the bully, guess what they're going to keep doing?
Come back.
They're going to keep bullying you. Now, let me change gears for a minute, because one of the things I'll see with poor boundaries, and I want to give a quick example. We could probably both give personal examples, but I'll tell about one I read about because it's always been fascinating to me, is the boundaries where you're doing something really good, but people want more. They want more. They want more. And the example I gave that has always really stuck out to me was a great missionary and his wife to Africa back in the early 1900s, and his name was John G. Lake. And they were doing great works of God, he and his wife, and there were so many wonderful things happening that people were coming all hours of the day and night to get help, to get prayer. They wanted healing or whatever, and they just wore themselves out, and they didn't say, hey, we've got to have some rest. And sadly, his wife got sick or ill, and she passed away there on the mission field. And it seems like it was just in really just trying to help people, trying to do the Lord's work, but they didn't have a boundary to say, I still have to take care of my body. I have to take care of myself emotionally. How does that fit in, and what's your perspective on that? Because I think a lot of believers probably have some boundary issues there.
Especially if it's in the name of serving.
Exactly. You're helping people.
Yeah, you're helping people. Or, think of a woman taking care of her children and not herself.
Yes.
Or a man working. The more he works, the more people praise him. Oh, he's a great provider. Again, this goes to even people that love you won't always recognize what you need.
Yes.
That you have to be responsible.
Yes.
For yourself, and you have to have personhood. You have to have limits. You have to know what your limits are. And so we can get confused and think that our limits are weakness. And it's not weakness to be tired. It's not weakness to want to be quiet. It's not weakness to say, no, I'm not doing anything. Or just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And if people are benefiting from you, they're not likely to say, you know what, you're doing too much. Because they're not going to recognize it, and they're not responsible.
They're not really responsible for that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
it's kind of like that. If that smoker gets in a car and I don't say anything, he just assumes it's fine to puff a few while we're driving across town. But if I recognize it and I say something, in even like you said, even when even when it's a very good cause, we have to look out for that. We're responsible for our vessel, or for people under our authority or in our family. So we have to we got to look out for our children, and as a husband and wife, we look out for each other too.
Yeah, it's not a guilty pleasure to rest.
Yeah.
It's a responsibility to be rested. And
that's so good. The Bible says, Hebrews 4, the rest chapter, it says, labor or work hard to enter into rest. Sometimes it's hard work, especially when you're going from fractured or no boundaries into healthy boundaries. It really is hard work, isn't it? We've seen so many people. They have to work at that to get into that place of rest. Talk to us about walls, Carolyn, because one of the, and you mentioned it just a little bit in the beginning, but we have seen so many times people will say, well, I'm just setting a boundary. And it's like, no, you are building a wall. So tell us about that.
So a wall is when you do something without asking another person that it affects.
Okay.
it's like someone deciding we're not going.
Yep.
Or I'm taking you off my bank account, or your family can't come visit.
Yep.
So, and it's posed as a boundary when really it's a punishment. So something that the other person should have had the right to vote.
The right to vote, I like that phrase.
When you take someone's vote, like, oh no, you don't get to vote on this. I'll tell you. Yeah, or if you do it in anger, or you do it to punish someone or teach them a lesson, or think about how many people I treat who have 25, 30, 35-year-old adult children, and they will control their money so they won't drink or use drugs.
Oh, yeah.
Or they'll try and take their car, or they'll call their job for them to see if they're there. Some of those things can be posed as concern, love, trying to help someone get better. But really, it's not right boundaries to make decisions for another adult. It's especially if you're uninvited. And so another thing that a wall does is eventually, if someone has issues of feeling unsafe, their boundaries get bigger and bigger and bigger, and pretty soon their personal space is so big that no matter what you do, you're going to step on their toes. And so when someone has issues with feeling safe, they tend to isolate. They tend to have a great big personal space. They get offended easily. They feel criticized easily. They feel controlled easily. And in the feeling controlled easily, they don't know it, but they become very controlling.
Oh, yeah.
And so then they start setting up a series of controls, walls. You can't do this. You can't do that. If you talk to me, you can't talk to me this way. You can't talk to me when I'm eating. You can't call me here, but you can call me here. So if someone
it gets
has
complicated.
A crazy list of rules, those are walls.
Yeah.
And I had a client that had this crazy list of rules for sex.
Oh boy.
And her husband, three of us were together, and he was telling me the rules, and I said, okay, wait, tell me, under what circumstances can you have sex?
Can you?
And I couldn't find it.
Oh, no.
And he couldn't find it, and that's why they were there. And I'm not picking on anybody, but when you have a crazy list of rules, you usually are trying to just cut something off. Like, I've had clients that would ground their kids for little things, but ground them for weeks.
Yeah.
And in the end, they just wanted the kids in the house, under their, watch, and not out with other kids. It was control.
Yeah.
It really wasn't safety. It wasn't real. It wasn't boundaries. It were walls and controls.
It really takes courage to let go of control. But you have to have some insight first. And so that's one of the reasons we're talking about boundaries. Because I may have somebody in my world that is tending towards those walls or those controls, and until I say, that's not really going to work for me, right? We don't bring any light into it. And one of our greatest verses, Carolyn and I have done so many conferences and stuff together, but one of my favorite verses is Isaiah 5:25. Woe unto those who call good evil and evil good, that put light for darkness, darkness for light, and sweet for bitter and bitter for sweet. And that's a lot of what we're talking about, is to try to get this clarity. And when we can have the conversation, we can also get some feedback, right? If we can just have the conversation as opposed to it being just unilateral or silent rules, or, oh, that's a rule too. Oh, that's a rule too. If we can have the dialogue, right? Which obviously is one of the reasons we're coming in for counseling. So.
I think a misstep in the big picture is we will get preoccupied with how something's going to go over. So we decide, they'll get upset, I'm not going to say that, or, they're not likely to change, I'm not going to bring that up. And you have to get out of the outcomes.
Yes.
So a personal boundary is how this person feels about this is kind of none of my business.
Yeah.
And how they react is kind of none of my business. And if my motive is to say it gently to say it with love, and I do manage to say something as nicely as I can, I really have to stay out of the outcome of how it's received. And if you know something won't be received well, and then you decide not to say it, that means you don't have any boundaries.
It also means you're sinning, because James says if you know the right thing to do and you don't do it, that's sin.
Ooh. I'm going to grab that. But yeah, and it's also, so we talk about other people being controlling. See, that's a control on our end that's internal. Oh, that will upset people. I'm
They
not
might
going to say
this,
that.
or they might do
If
that.
I
Yes.
say this, they'll do that. And
Yes.
so there's that childhood training, squash it, because someone's going to be unhappy.
Yes.
So
That's so good, Carolyn. And you know, we don't think about this very much. We think that love is just fuzzy and cushy and all that, but it actually takes courage to love in the full way that God wants us to love, right? And over we see in Scripture, we'll see it, for example, in Galatians chapter 6, we'll see it in 2 Timothy chapter 2, but it's got something like this. You who are spiritual, confront that person with love. Be meek, be humble, but we're still have to have the courage to confront them, right? We do it with love. I don't want any unnecessary pain. Right? We're trying to do it with love, but we're supposed to do it. And we need more of that in the church. We need more of that in the world, don't we? Yeah. Oh, this has been so rich, Carolyn. Are there any other things that, you know, we've talked about boundaryless, no boundaries, fractured boundaries. We talked about walls. Are there any other kind of closing thoughts or a story, anything else that, you know, maybe it's positive, negative example, whatever?
I'll say 2 techniques.
Okay, thank you.
So people who don't typically set boundaries, I'll give them 2 techniques.
Oh, that's great. That's what we need. We need some techniques.
So number 1, ask yourself, if I knew no one would be upset, what would I say?
Oh.
So you disengage the
like
10
that one.
steps ahead.
It's like you put yourself in the director's chair. I tell people to put themselves in the director's chair.
Yeah, if I knew no one would be upset, no one's feelings would be hurt, what would I actually say here? The second thing is when, you know, of course, this is usually when I'm working with couples, they'll keep giving each other details. But you said this, but you said that. But we went here, but we went there. But when we went there.
Right.
And get to a request.
Okay.
Get to a request. Quit citing evidence. Quit giving examples. At some point, just say, hey, next time, would you? And you know what? That's
Next
a boundary.
time, would you not smoke when you ride in my car?
Next time, would you ride with someone else?
Right.
I'm going to smoke.
Smoke in somebody else's. There you go.
So, yeah, and so if you simply get to a request with someone,
like
you're
that.
setting a boundary. You know,
like
at
that.
work, like, hey, don't use my desk when your desk is full.
Yeah.
Or you know what? If you use a conference room, remember to clean it.
Yeah.
Or, hey, don't, you know, I'd rather you not tell stories like that in front of my kids.
Yeah.
You know, or just, hey, don't call after 9 at night. That doesn't work. So when you're hinting about things and you don't get to a request, you know, it's boundarylessness.
I like that. I tell my couples, listen, a healthy relationship, and that's where we're headed, not only can handle correction or complaints or requests, but it requires it. We need that from each other. Yeah. So those are so good. I so appreciate the tips. And I'm so thankful that you came to talk about boundaries today. This has been very rich.
Fun.
Very rich. Carolyn, could you tell people how they could get in touch with you if they want to come as an individual or a couple and learn more?
Right. My number is 214-317-3862. And also my email is cdunegan1@me.com. And those are the 2 best ways. One is a text, the other is an email.
Well, thank you so much for being on, Carolyn. It's always a joy to work with you. We want to have you back on. And remember, we've got a lot of resources on SamaritansWell.com. And thanks for listening to our show on boundaries. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do us a favor and like, subscribe, and share with others who might need it. And you can find additional resources at SamaritansWell.com.